Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we're going to cover 3 John, 13 verses in it, and I'm calling this one, What Kind of Believer Do You Want to Be? Today we're going to discuss the last epistle of the Apostle John. Some scholars believe that John wrote this letter after he wrote the book of Revelation, and it could very well be his last writing. He identifies himself as the elder, and he was likely in his 90s at the time. I have read that the average lifespan in the time of Jesus was 29 years old for a man in Israel. But truly, I don't know how anyone possibly could know that. But based on infant mortality, diseases, wars, and violence, the average age at death was certainly less than what it is now. John, living into his 90s, demonstrates God's hand. I often have thought about the days before the Great Flood, when men lived much longer than after the flood. For example, Adam died at the age of 930. Adam's great-grandson, Methuselah, died in the year of the Great Flood at the age of 969. Jewish tradition states that Methuselah died 1 week before the flood, and God gave Noah 7 days to grieve. But think about that. The people alive a week before the flood could have known a man personally who was the great-grandson of Adam. So they could know the great-grandson of a man who walked with God in the Garden of Eden. There are great-grandfathers currently here in the South who are 35. There are 1,656 years in the genealogies between Adam and the flood. Imagine what it was like for Christians near the end of the 1st century who knew John. John, who had walked with Jesus for 3 years and knew him very well. Remember, all the other apostles, including Paul, were gone, having been martyred, and John was the last of the close eyewitnesses. Certainly he was the elder, but today we will see an unexpected response. Let's read the first 8 verses of 3 John. The elder, to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when brethren came and testified of the truth that is in you, just as you walk in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers, who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth for his name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. In this brief letter, we are going to be introduced to 3 men. Well, there are 4 men, but we know John already. John will introduce us to Gaius first. Let's see what John has to say about him. First, John loved Gaius in truth. Of course, that is agape love, so we know that John loved him completely with the love of God. And agape love is always in truth. John refers to Gaius as beloved. John was the spiritual father of Gaius, which means that John had taught Gaius, shared Jesus with Gaius. The name Gaius means to rejoice and was a common Roman name at that time. In fact, there was a Roman leader named Gaius Caesar who died in the year 4 AD. The Gaius in this letter is thought to be the same Gaius baptized by Paul in Corinth, who became a traveling companion of Paul. At that time, during the early church, there were missionaries, traveling pastors, who were spreading the word. Gaius sounds like he must have been a leader in the church, to which John had sent this epistle. Look at the many godly attributes of Gaius commended by John. Gaius had a wonderful testimony, as others had mentioned to John how strong the truth was within Gaius. And certainly, no one would know that unless Gaius was sharing God's truth with others. It wasn't just an act, as John knew that Gaius was walking in the truth. John referred to Gaius as one of his children. John also had heard that Gaius was faithful in how he treated fellow Christians and strangers, and many had mentioned this to the church. In 1 Corinthians, Paul had quoted the law of Moses that said, "You must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain." And Paul explained that this meant the church should take care of the needs of the ones who were sharing God's word. Paul, though, worked as a tent maker and provided for most of his own needs. Here, John mentions that Gaius and those he received at his church would not accept money from Gentiles, unbelievers. And these men, like John, were fellow workers for the truth. How would we feel if John wrote such glowing words to us? Once again, God gives all believers gifts, and we are responsible for how we use those gifts. But do not brag on the gifts. Instead, brag on the giver. Now let's read the next passage about two other Christians, likely at the same church as Gaius. Verses 9 through 14 of 3 John says this: "I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has a good testimony from all, and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. I had many things to write, but I do not wish to write to you with pen and ink. But I hope to see you shortly, and we shall speak face to face. Peace to you. Our friends greet you. Greet the friends by name." The first and last men whom John described in this epistle were godly men, but the one in the middle was a mess. Please don't fiddle with the one in the middle, for there's nothing in the middle to fiddle with. Let's go to the third man first, Demetrius. Like Gaius, the testimony of Demetrius was also solid. That means that other believers had informed John about the walk of Demetrius, not just his words. This is the only mention of Demetrius in the Bible. But imagine John complimented Demetrius in the Bible for all of us to read. Pretty special to be remembered that way. Now let's move on to Diotrephes. Diotrephes had a huge ego, it says in verse 9, and always put himself first. The Bible teaches that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So I'm guessing Diotrephes will be last if he makes the cut at all. John also mentions that Diotrephes did not accept what John said, also in verse 9. So he did not accept biblical truth. In the introduction to this book earlier, we discussed how special it would be to listen to John. After all, he walked with Jesus for 3 years, was at the crucifixion, spent time with the risen Christ, and had spent his entire life worshiping Jesus, learning more about Jesus, and teaching about Jesus. And this man treated John with disdain. People with big egos are little men, and this is not referring to their physical bodies. It's similar to the fact that most bullies are afraid of being hurt and afraid of not being liked. Next, John called attention to the fact that Diotrephes made malicious comments about John and his cohorts. In verse 10, the Amplified Bible translates this as wicked words and unjustified charges. Sure sounds like slander to me. Next, also in verse 10, we see that Diotrephes does not receive the brethren. Again, there were people traveling between churches in those early days of the church. And we can see in numerous places in the Bible that we as believers are called to be hospitable. 1 Peter 4:9 says, "Be hospitable to one another without grumbling." Romans 12, verses 9 through 13 says this, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality." Diotrephes disregarded spiritual authority by not following these statements by the leaders of the early church. In fact, not only was he not hospitable to those traveling Christians, but if any of the people in his church treated those people with hospitality, Diotrephes would excommunicate the hospitable members of his church. It sounds like it was the church of Diotrephes rather than the church of God. We also see that Diotrephes imitated what is evil instead of what is good. Diotrephes has not seen God, according to verse 11. John mentioned the good testimonies that he had received concerning both Gaius and Demetrius, but Diotrephes did not have a good testimony. Diotrephes is a Greek name meaning nourished by Zeus. I'm guessing that he was a Christian convert from Greece and had received his food from Zeus rather than from the one true God. At the end of the epistle, John states that he is tired of writing and would rather have this discussion face to face. I would have loved to have been there for that one. One of the sons of thunder speaking to a man who is destroying the church and destroying the spirits of people within the church. While I believe that Diotrephes was a real person and this was a real situation, I also believe that God has made sure this is part of our Bible because it applies to many people within the church. Having been in church leadership positions, it can be a little like the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. There still are godly men and godly churches, but unfortunately, there also are many who resemble Diotrephes. Be wary of people who want to be on the church board because they are good with money but do not know the Bible. I have mentioned this before, but in one of the first churches I attended, the ushers had clickers at the door and used those to count people as they walked through the door. At the end of the service, the pastor wanted the offering counted within 5 minutes of the end of that service and wanted to know the total amount of tithes as well as tithes per person because he wanted to figure out what subjects he could preach on that would bring in the most tithes. In Ephesians, Paul teaches us how the church should look today, and I've yet to find one that resembles those encouraging guidelines. But with numerous churches and the freedom of choosing a church, find one that teaches the Bible well and accurately, teaches through the Bible instead of a verse here and a verse there, loves people to Jesus. And for me, one that does not avoid addressing sin. But if teaching through the Bible, this will happen naturally. Find a pastor more concerned with loving others and teaching the word than being the CEO. And after finding that church, serve. God has given all of us gifts. John's words here demonstrate that the early church was attacked, just as church today continues to be attacked. False doctrines, false teachers, and false prophets can be on one side of the building, while false requirements, false expectations, and false behavior, hypocrisy, can exist on the other side of the building. Find the right fit and do not forsake the gathering of believers. All right, we finished 3 John, and tomorrow we will start Jude. Have a blessed day. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina.